Thank you, Tiffany. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our third weeds biocontrol or biocontrol of weeds talk from our team. This afternoon we've got Paul Peterson. Paul is one of our senior researchers and a bit of a whiz kid between doing all the work and fieldwork experiments and lab experiments, as well as designing and carrying out real science experiments as well. And Paul has been following this work on the heather beetle for a very long time now. So he's got some really interesting stuff to tell us. So hand it over to you now, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Appreciate being called a whiz kid. I'm not sure that's true, but we'll go with that. Kia ora koutou. The title of my presentation is Recent Spread of Heather Beetle in and around Tongariro National Park. Right. So more than 100 years ago, the then warden of the area that's now Tongariro National Park, his name was John Cullen, he looked at the landscape and he thought this looks like a really good place to try and recreate Scottish grouse moors. So in Scotland there are vast areas of heather that are managed so that people can shoot grouse, and it's quite lucrative. And no doubt he thought that he could set something up in the park. So he introduced sacks and sacks of heather seed, Calluna vulgaris, which is the plant there you can see with purple flowers. And these seeds were spread for quite a number of years between 1912 and 1923 to try and establish heather. And then the grouse, the birds were introduced, and the vision was to have guys like you can see down here with dogs going out paying money and shooting grouse in the park. So it all sounded pretty attractive. The problem, there's a bit of a delay here with my PowerPoint. Okay, there we go, gremlins. The problem was that we were left with this scenario. So there were several reports done in the 80s, and there was an estimate of 50,000 hectares of dense heather like you can see here. And recently we think it's more like 60,000. It's continued to spread. And it's a problem because it basically just outcompetes everything else. And you can see there that it just overtops and excludes native vegetation. So DOC initiated a biocontrol program because there was no other practical solution. People tried to spray it and dig it out, and it was just impossible to keep on top of it. The Army did have some success spraying on their land, but DOC obviously couldn't do this because there was a non-target consequence of spraying herbicide onto vegetation. Aerially. So the beetle, for those of you that don't know about biocontrol, basically we go to the native range of the plant that's a problem in New Zealand, that's been introduced and is now a problem, and we look at what is damaging the weed overseas, and we try and figure out if there's something that will damage the plant that is safe to bring in New Zealand so it won't attack other plants. And for heather, the heather beetle is quite an obvious choice because it does a huge amount of damage in the UK, and they spray insecticide or have done in the past to try and manage this insect so that the heather will grow so that the grouse survives and they can have shooting. So it seemed like a really good option. So we released the insect after testing it thoroughly into the field in 1996. But we were disappointed because it didn't establish very well. We had 18 release sites and we only got establishment at one of those sites. But it did establish and we were able to redistribute it. But we also noticed that it seemed to spread quite slowly. So this is the desert road for those of you that have been along it. And we had a population here that started spreading in 2006. And it took about 5 years to travel half a kilometre. Whereas in Scotland, you'd expect it to do it in about half that time. So we had a slow start and we were a bit worried about it. We thought that it was going to be a sure thing and we were all excited, and we were a bit deflated after struggling for a decade or more with it. But things have improved over time, and Ronnie's spoken a bit about this the other day. So we've seen quite an increase in establishment success over the decades, which is something that is interesting and something we're looking at. But it's meant that insects are doing better, and we've seen insects spontaneously establishing in areas now where we haven't released them into, which is really encouraging. And over the last 3 years in particular, the populations just seem to have exploded. And I've done some mapping, and my estimate is that over the last 3 years alone, they've either killed or severely damaged 35,000 hectares of heather, which is quite impressive. This is an example of one of those little populations that have sprung up spontaneously. So this is standing on the road near National Park, and in the distance, I noticed a grey patch, and as I zoom in, you'll see it too. So this is an area of heather beetle damage, this grey area here, and in the background, I'm almost certain this is undamaged heather in amongst the flax bushes. So this is a little population that's just sprung out of perhaps a few individuals flying to that site, and we were seeing that happening all over the park. So we were starting to wonder how much area is actually covered now by the beetle, how far have they gone? It's very hard to actually figure that out. So we had to employ, in addition to the ground observations, we were making some aerial mapping to try and get a feel for what was going on. And these are just two shots of the same patch of heather, obviously from the roadside on the left and from the air on the right. So it just gives you a sort of a little bit of a feel for what heather looks like when it hasn't been damaged by the beetle. And bear in mind that all these photos have been taken in March when heather is flowering, so there's no trickery involved in some of these images that are coming up. So this is an example of a heather beetle invasion front. So these beetles have been eating this heather, and you can see that it's turned grey, and the heather in front of that grey area is purple, so it's still alive, and in the foreground too, it's a bit patchy. So this invasion is travelling this way. I guess you can see my cursor across into the undamaged area. This is near Wairu. And this is just a shot very close by, just showing the extent of the damage. So all this grey material here is dead heather. So the beetle's been busy. And I've just highlighted a few areas in the background there that look like they're actually undamaged. They're purple. You might need to use your imagination. I've been looking at these sorts of images for a while, so I've got a bit of a feel for it, but it looks to me like some of these areas on the periphery haven't yet been damaged. And that's because the beetle's still moving, it's still expanding. And this is in the New Zealand Defence Force area, the Wairu military training ground. And this is in Tongariro National Park. Again, in the foreground, this material's grey, and there's a tinge of purple up here, so which suggests that the insects are moving from here to here. But those are the sorts of images we were dealing with when we were trying to map what was happening. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run through a series of before and after photos, just to give you a feel for how effective this beetle has been in removing heather. And again, these photos are taken at the same time of the year. And just notice the dates as we go through, because there are some quite big gaps between when we took initial photos and then when we repeated those shots. So you'll notice on the left there's quite a lot of broom as well, which is another problem in this area, and the Army have been spraying quite diligently to try and remove this. So you can see on the right there that not only has the heather been knocked back, but the broom has as well. So this is still up in Tongariro National Park. This is actually a frost flat near Lake Rotorua that we've been following with interest for a number of years. And Vaughan Keesing, a master's student, took the fuzzy photo in the top left-hand corner in 1995, and you can see heather in there. And 5 years later, in 2000, it had almost choked out that whole frost flat. And then, interestingly, in 2014, the broom had started to invade. So That's interesting in itself. And in 2021, the beetles came through, and you can see that the beetles have removed all the purple heather. So now the broom is spreading unbridled, unfortunately. This is the same frost flat from the air. So you can see all this grey material is dead heather. And this is the broom invasion coming in. These are just a few shots. These are 21 years apart. So I assume people listening know about Tongariro National Park and the volcanoes up there. So there is Ngāruahui, Tongariro and Ruapehu. You can see those in the background. So those of you that ski, this is the chateau at the base of Ruapehu. I'm not sure of the age of this shot, it's quite old, but this is heather, and you can confirm that by looking at the grey areas here. We know that's dead heather, so this must have been live heather. It just hasn't got very good colour rendition. Now, these shots demonstrate the knockdown ability of heather, the heather beetle, but also the fact that we are getting a rebound. You can see some flowering here, and this is what we expect. Biocontrol agents will never eradicate weeds. They co-evolve, they have co-evolved with weeds and they coexist with them. What we're hoping for is to get down to a much lower density of the weed after introducing biocontrol agent. So we're very interested in this rebound because we want to know what sort of level heather sits at after it's had herbivory and sustained herbivory. So we wouldn't expect it to go back to that image in 2003. We'd expect there to be heather in the environment, but a lot less of it. And this is another example. Near Lake Morwhanga on the army land again, so a lot of heather, beetles been through, it's taken it out, you can see some recovery coming back. That's not something, that's not a surprise to us, it's something we'd expect. So based on all of those images, I've mapped where I think heather is. It's still an estimate, and I'm sure that people will say, well, that's wrong, but we think roughly from that polygon measures about 60,000 hectares. So that's what we're working with prior to the insect moving through, prior to the beetle moving through the infestation. And I just wanted to put these polygons in. So we've got, this is DOC administered land and this is army administered land, and there's Tūwhare Toa administer some of this area in here too. So there are a few major landowners that are involved with this. And you can see that the areas of infestation are quite large. So that's back to the base map again, that's just the heather extent. And this is an overlay of where I think the beetles have got to. So I think about 2/3 of the heather has either been killed or badly damaged by heather, so 40,000 hectares. And there are areas that we couldn't fly over in the plane due to cloud cover or a lack of time that we need to investigate a bit further. Beetles may have travelled into some of these areas, but we're just not sure. So you might say that looks pretty good, but what are the benefits? What do we actually know about what's happening? Well, we've just recently published this paper here that shows quite clearly that biocontrol is doing a good job, and even better than what you'd expect from herbicide. And there's two reasons for that. The beetles actually are more thorough, and they also have no non-target impacts. So the herbicide used actually takes out dicot species, so it takes out heather and other native dicots. But the heather beetle doesn't do that, it just takes out heather. One of the downsides that we've found from this is that as you remove such a massive percentage of the canopy, you get other plants coming back. And this paper has demonstrated how we have seen some recovery in native vegetation, but there's also exotics that have come in, and exotic grasses are one of those. So we've seen increases in tussocks, but we've also seen increases in exotic grasses. So we want to follow that development to see what happens, whether or not the grasses eventually disappear again, or whether or not they become a long-term problem. So when we set the experiment up to measure these impacts, we had to spray insecticide in some of our plots and some of our treatment plots so that we had a control, so that we had areas where heather remained after the insect had been through. So this is just an example of a plot, and it shows you if you exclude the insects from the plot, the heather survives. It's quite a striking example of how the biocontrol agent's working. And these are just a few pics of heather that's been killed by the beetle. So you can see the dead stalks there and the grey heather that's been killed. And these are some of the plants that recover and benefit from this. So the Dracophyllum, and this is red tussock. And here we've got a native Coprosma that is recovering in amongst a thick patch of heather that's been eaten by beetles and will eventually die. So the other sorts of benefits we've considered are benefits to the invertebrate community and vertebrates, lizards. So Vaughan Keesing in 1995 looked at, this is before the heather beetle was in New Zealand, he looked at areas with and without heather, and he looked at how the invertebrates varied. And he was able to demonstrate that as heather moves in, it does change invertebrate assemblages, and it favours spiders mainly. And we think that's because heather has quite a complicated architecture, and it's very good for web building. And there are other things that disappear, like Hemiptera and Hymenoptera and Diptera. You find less of these orders of insects in areas where heather has invaded. And another student, Andrew, he then went into the environment after beetles had been through, and he looked at whether or not assemblages had reverted back or changed back to what they were before. And the simple answer is yes. After heather is removed, you tend to get invertebrate assemblages that resemble those that were there before the heather invasion. So that's quite good. And he also found positive impacts on skinks, so that the numbers of skinks were much higher in areas where heather beetles had actually removed heather. And more recently, we're starting to look at the consequences of weed control, and this is work that Chris is leading. So we're looking at not just the above ground processes, but what happens in the soil as plants invade and then when they're removed. Do you get positive changes that resemble, so that the soil resembles what it was before, or do things change? So the next steps, we need to go and do a little bit more checking to see how high the beetles will go, because there's some uncertainty about what sort of altitude they can tolerate in terms of surviving out there, because it's quite a harsh climate. And we know heather is quite high up on the mountain, above where the beetles currently are. We also want to monitor the heather rebound, and we're already doing this at one site. So we want to see what's happening and whether or not how much of the heather will come back, and also whether or not the invasive grasses persist, or whether they eventually peter out. So we also, as Ronnie talked about the other day, we want to look at why they took so long initially, because we may be able to learn from this. So we're testing some original hypotheses that we looked at when we first had trouble. So we're looking at climate changes and whether or not climate has changed over the last 25 years and it now favours beetle survival. We're also looking at adaptation. So that could be morphological or behavioural. And we're also looking at the nitrogen in heather. because heather on the Central Plateau has unusually low nitrogen, and it's partly because of the substrate that it grows in, and perhaps because the atmosphere is quite clean. But over in the UK, we know nitrogen levels are higher, quite a lot higher, and we know that as nitrogen deposition gets worse in the UK and in Europe, that insects are doing a lot better. So low nitrogen can be a problem for insects when they're trying to develop. So that's all I have. I just have some acknowledgements. So Laurie Kens and Jonathan Pearson, they helped me to get the aerial photography. I can't fly planes. My photography is not that good. And I'm ashamed to say I did actually throw up in the plane. Hopefully there was no one on the desert road at the time. Harry Keys has been a part of this project right from day one. And I think it'd be fair to say Harry was a little sceptical early on, and rightly so, but I think he now is quite excited with developments. And I've also had great support from the Defence Force staff, Stephen, who manages the Defence Force land in New Zealand, and a couple of the guys from Range Control. So that's all I have.
Excellent, Paul. Thank you very much for that. I think everyone can tell that that's and it so far has been an exceedingly comprehensive series of studies around the biological control of heather in New Zealand, and there's been a lot of ecological studies that have added evidence to the work that's gone on there that you guys have been doing. So very cool stuff. Paul, we have some questions for you. So one is from John Stanaland, and Charlotte Simmons has asked a similar question as well. John says, why would a beetle kill out its entire food source? Charlotte adds to that by saying, yes, I was wondering what happens to the beetles once they've killed all the heather. So this kind of goes back to that original introduction that you made about how biocontrol works. Try and give a brief answer if you could, Paul.
The beetles will never eat all the heather. They will never find it all. It's kind of like a game of cat and mouse. So there'll always be plants that escape. And vast numbers of beetles will die initially after they've been through the bulk of the heather. And then from that point on, there'll be an equilibrium of sorts, if that makes sense.
Cool. Excellent. Thanks, Paul. Andrew Pugh has asked, are all the native plant species we would expect to see coming back, or are some missing? So what's the biodiversity of the natives that are coming back through? Do you know?
That's a really interesting question, and something that we are looking at, well, hoping to look at in future. And the answer is, I think it comes down to when you actually get onto the problem. If you wait too long, and you can imagine plants being totally excluded from an area, native plants, it could take a very long time for those plants to recover. Some will come back faster than others. So in areas where there's not much heather and the beetle goes through, I expect that we'd see a very similar range of plants. But in areas that have been really badly affected by heather, we may find that some species take some time to come back. So that's the simple answer to that, if that's a simple answer.
Cool. Excellent, Paul, thank you. Fiona Hennessy has really made a comment saying that she worked in the park in the mid-80s and she did a little bit of time on weed control, and she said it's absolutely awesome to see the results that you can see occurring in the national park these days, which is very true. David Price has asked a question. Are there other significant areas of heather in other parts of New Zealand, in the South Island, or are these areas candidates for similar management?
The short answer is no, there aren't other significant areas, but there are other infestations in New Zealand. There's one at Mount Cook, but they are actively controlling that with herbicide, which is not compatible with biocontrol. I don't know if that's a long-term prospect, the herbicide application, but we'll see. But no, the Central Plateau is the area where heather has really taken off.
Okay. Charlotte Simmons has asked a question: if the beetles go without their preferred food source for long enough, instead of dying off, might some not adapt to eat other dicots, ones we don't want them to?
We have no evidence for that happening in sensible timescales. If you're talking about, millions of years, then that's a different kettle of fish. But the insects, if they run out of food, they'll die quite quickly. And as I say, we've got no evidence to suggest that that they'll switch. In fact, insects, if anything, tend to specialise rather than generalise. So as they evolve, they tend to get more specialised. So we're not worried about that.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. It's one of the things about biological control is that it works on a natural process, and that our insects are tested extensively to ensure that they won't attack any other species of plants outside of the one that we've targeted them for. Okay, I think, oh no, we still, looks like we have one, not a question. This is from Reese Burns. Quite a bit of heather along roadways, examples in Western Bay Road, Lake Taupo, near Poriora, and increasingly in geothermal areas near Rotorua. Yeah, Paul, I thought there was heather around Rotorua. Is that true? Did we make any releases around there?
Yes, we have, and insects are there eating heather as we speak, but it's nothing compared to what we're seeing on the Central Plateau or in Tongariro National Park and in the Army Land. But you are right, and I've noticed that heather along roadways tends to escape beetle attack, and we're not quite sure why that's happening. It happens along main roads and also tracks on the Army Land, and I know that the insects are pretty feeble, and if they get knocked off plants, they may struggle to get back up, especially in that sort of very sandy environment where you get some of those tracks forming. So yeah, we'll always see heather around the place, but the goal is to get the bulk of it down to a manageable level so we don't have to spray it and it won't decimate the native flora.
Cool. Selwyn June has asked, does the beetle attack heather seedlings, and are they part of the rebound or regeneration that you get?
Yes, they do attack all stages of the plant. The rebound, I think, it can be from seed or it can be from existing plants, and it really depends on the life stage of the beetle that attacks the plant. So we find that the beetle larvae are very, very thorough, and they go through and they kill plants outright, whereas the adults don't seem to do the same job. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it. If you're an adult beetle and you're laying eggs on a plant for your babies, progeny, killing the plant's counterproductive. So I think what happens is insects move through, feed, lay eggs, and then the larvae emerge and then nail the plant. But there are some areas where adults are feeding, like before winter, where they're not laying eggs. So you will get bands of vegetation, or bands of heather that hasn't been killed entirely, and you end up with flower or purple tufts on the top of stems. So the plants are still alive, but they've taken a bit of a beating. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. Selwyn's also asked about, has the beetle been introduced to here, where heather has recently established?
No.
No? Okay. Selwyn's also asked, somebody else has asked in between, but Selwyn's also asked about, will our studies go on to look at the issue of broom resurgence and broom invading? So you might want to say a little bit about that.
Yes, I was hoping someone would ask a question about that, because I sort of baited, well, I was fishing for a question with those comments about the frost flat. Yes, we currently have a broom gall mite, which seems to be quite effective against broom. So something I'd like to do at least is look at that frost flat, and when the broom gall mite invades that area, look at that impact and whether or not it can actually take the broom out. So that would be an example of one weed being removed, replaced by another, and then that weed being removed as well, which would be quite nice to demonstrate.
And so far, if I can just add to that, the broom gall mite has been highly successful in many areas of New Zealand at removing broom from on a landscape scale and reducing it by up to 75–80% of the original population. So we certainly have great hopes for the impact of the broom gall mite in many areas of New Zealand. Anita Benbrook, I think this will be about the last question, but she asks, does the beetle have an effect on Spanish heath?
No.
Unfortunately not.
Unfortunately
yeah, that's
not.
right. No, unfortunately not. We only wish, but it is too specific for that. So. Someone just made a sort of, it looks like a last comment saying this is really great. We were involved in a DOC summer program digging out brooms some years ago along the western roadside, and it was damned hard work. Which it is, that's dead right. All right, I think that's about where we will leave it. Thank you very much, Paul, for your talk and for answering all those questions, and thank you very much for everybody for coming along and participating in another one of our webinars. And we'll catch you all later. Thanks a lot. Kia ora koutou.